My brother got millions and I got an old cabin in the woods, but what I found inside changed everything. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. What city are you from? Write in the comments. Let's see where you're watching us from. The day of my father's funeral felt like standing at the bottom of a well, the air too still, too dense with memories that pressed in from every direction. It was held on a pale October afternoon, the sun more decoration than warmth, hanging high behind gauzy clouds like an old eye that had seen too much. The cemetery was quiet, perched at the edge of a hill overlooking a sweep of dry prairie and pine. Not many came. A few neighbors, some from the old tribal council, a couple of distant cousins I hadn't seen in years. No eulogies full of sentiment, no extravagant rituals, just earth, breath, and the blunt truth of goodbye. My older brother Jason arrived late, always grand. His charcoal coat looked more expensive than anything I'd ever owned. He wore dark sunglasses even though there was no sun, and spoke softly into his phone before tucking it away and stepping forward. His presence was a kind of punctuation, clean, professional, and entirely disconnected from the place we'd come from. When the minister invited him to say a few words, he did, something about strength, about legacy, the sort of polished grief that fits well into business newsletters or carefully worded family statements. But it didn't come from him. It came from some image of who he wanted to be. I stood a few steps back, watching, remembering a very different man. Our father, standing barefoot in the fields behind the old house, his hands caked with soil, telling us stories of when the river still ran clear and the trees spoke if you listened long enough. His story had so unlike our own house that we longed to go inside to see who he wanted to be. And then I sat and lost my mind. He was a quiet man, never gave advice unless asked, never boasted, never demanded our affection. But he believed in something deeper than land or law. He believed in the thread that ran through generations. You can be broke, he once told me, but don't ever be rootless. I carried those words in my chest like a stone I didn't know how to skip. After the burial, we all gathered briefly at the tribal hall for weak coffee and small talk. Jason slipped out early, citing a meeting in Tulsa. I stayed back, picking through memories like ash. The last 6 months had been hard. Dad had grown weaker, slower, his eyes clouding with both sickness and knowing. He never said it outright, but I could feel it. He was preparing for an end. And through it all, I was there. I brought him medicine, helped him bathe, listened to stories that made no sense until they suddenly did. Jason visited once, stayed half an hour, left with a distracted promise to call more often. He never did. When the day finally came to read the will, I walked into the notary's office with no expectations, just the dull ache of closing a door. The lawyer was an older man named Rickman, whom I recognized from local council meetings years ago. He shook our hands, motioned us to sit, and began reading in a tone too smooth to feel human. "To Jason Reynolds," he said, "the property at 1450 Meadow Creek Avenue, all bank accounts listed in the attached appendix, the 2018 Lexus SUV, and the investment portfolio held at Stalwart Financial." I didn't flinch. I waited. I told myself it didn't matter, that it couldn't matter. "To Lucas Reynolds," he continued, "the title and full rights to the house and surrounding woodland parcel located off Route 9 near the Red Hollow Reservation boundary." And that was all. No stocks, no vehicles, no accounts. Just that house. The one everyone had forgotten. The one half swallowed by trees and memory. Jason didn't react much, just a small twitch at the corner of his mouth, almost a smirk. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, as if this had gone exactly as expected. Rickman concluded the session with formalities and asked if there were any questions. Jason declined. I asked if our father had left any personal letters, anything else, photos, messages, notes. Rickman paused a moment too long before shaking his head. Outside, the wind had picked up. Dry leaves scraped across the sidewalk like restless fingers. Jason clapped me on the shoulder before heading to his car. "No hard feelings, little brother," he said. "Dad was old school. You know how he was. All yours now. Enjoy the wilderness." He drove off with a puff of dust. I stood there, staring after him, my throat dry. I wasn't angry, not really. It was something deeper than that, something like disbelief. A part of me wanted to go back inside, to demand clarity, to know why. I didn't. Instead, I packed what little I had into a borrowed pickup truck and headed west. No job to leave behind, no apartment to clear, just me, a few boxes, and a question I couldn't name. The road out of the city gave way to hills, then to dirt, then to nothing at all. The sky opened up like a wound, endless and soft, the kind of blue that makes you feel smaller than you ever realized. Pines lined the last stretch of trail before the house came into view. It stood like an old sentinel, part of the land more than a part of the world. 2 stories, weather-worn, roof sagging in places, windows streaked with years of neglect. A faded wooden totem leaned against a porch railing, its paint chipped, but the carvings still vivid. An eagle, a bear, and a man reaching for something just out of reach. The door creaked open with a push. Inside, it smelled of dust and memory. Cobwebs curtained the corners. Floorboards groaned beneath my boots. There were no modern comforts, no heat, no internet, barely any electricity. But there was something else, something thicker than air, like the house itself was watching. I set down my bags in what had once been the living room. A stone hearth dominated one wall, darkened with soot, cold and waiting. I lit a fire from kindling stacked by the door. The flame took slowly, but when it caught, the room shifted. The shadows danced. The silence stirred. I walked the house slowly, each room a capsule of forgotten time. The kitchen still held old jars of dried herbs. The bedroom upstairs had a dresser full of shirts folded decades ago. On the windowsill, a bundle of dried sage lay cracked and gray. There were photos, too, faded black and white ones, some newer color prints. Dad as a young man, lean and strong. My grandmother in full regalia, her eyes full of something I couldn't name. Me and Jason, much younger, standing on the porch of this same house, grinning like fools. That night, I didn't sleep much. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. Owls called to each other across the dark. And then there was the dream. Or maybe not a dream. A man stood before me in the old woods. He wore beaded garments, long hair braided down his back. In one hand, he held a carved symbol, an eagle not unlike the one on the totem. He said nothing, just raised his arm and pointed, not at me, but past me, toward a wall I couldn't see. I woke before dawn, heart pounding. The fire had died to embers. The house was silent again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been shown something, that the story of this place, of my father, of me, had only just begun, and that whatever it was, it waited behind a wall. The house woke slowly the next morning, as if reluctant to acknowledge the day. Pale shafts of light cut through the cracks in the window frames, touching dust motes that hung in the air like flecks of memory. I lay on the old sofa under a thin wool blanket, still heavy with the weight of the dream. That man, the symbol he held, the gesture toward something hidden, it all hovered on the edge of understanding, like a word I could feel on the tip of my tongue but could not speak. The fire had gone out sometime in the night. My breath hung visibly in the cold morning air, and I forced myself up, joints aching more from rest than labor. I moved about the kitchen, hunting for coffee or tea, finding only a rusted kettle and some brittle black leaves that might once have been mint. I boiled water, drank in silence, and let my eyes wander to the grain of the wooden walls, as though they might offer some kind of direction. It was while cleaning that I found it. I had begun to clear away the detritus of neglect, old books warped by moisture, yellowing papers, broken chairs. I moved toward the far end of the main room, where a tall, built-in shelf stretched from floor to ceiling. Most of the shelves were empty, save for a few faded photographs and a carved eagle perched at the top. But something about the frame caught my eye. The wood near the middle shelf bore a slight indentation, more than just age, a thin seam where none should have been. I ran my fingers along it, pressing gently, until I heard a soft click. A section of the shelf eased forward, and a narrow panel behind it swung inward with a long, creaking groan. Cold air flowed from the opening. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stop, to turn away, to pretend I'd found nothing. But I didn't. I retrieved a flashlight from my backpack, clicked it on, and stepped into the darkness. The passage behind the wall was narrower than I'd expected. The air was dry, stale, but not rank. The walls had been lined with wooden boards, worn smooth with time. As I moved deeper, the beam of light illuminated small details. Scratches along the walls, the edge of a nail protruding, a frayed rope looped on a nail. At the end of the passage, a wooden door stood sealed with an old latch. I lifted it. The door groaned open. I stepped inside a space that felt like a pocket hidden in the ribs of the world. A single window, no larger than a sheet of paper, let in a blade of soft light. The room was lined with crates, trunks, and bundles wrapped in thick cloth and tied with leather cords. Dust covered everything, and yet I felt no decay. Instead, there was reverence, as though someone had not just stored these items but safeguarded them. I knelt and opened the nearest trunk. Inside lay a stack of leather-bound journals, their spines worn, titles scrawled in fading ink. I picked one up. The cover read, P.T. Redhawk, 1867. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The handwriting was delicate, looping, elegant. The first page read, I write this by candlelight, in the home my hands built with cedar and pine, on land my people have walked for generations. Should I die before my words are heard, let them serve as witness. We endured. I read on, heart pounding, each entry a fragment of a life carved from hardship and resistance. Tales of the Trail of Tears, of a grandmother who walked barefoot through snow, of a brother shot for refusing to leave his land. There were passages about healing, about vision quests and ceremonies and herbs I had only heard of in whispers, names I recognized from family stories, others unfamiliar but now forever etched in ink and blood. I opened another trunk. This one held ceremonial garments, buckskin, feathers, beads, arranged in perfect painstaking symmetry. There were masks carved from wood, their faces frozen in eternal song or grief. In a smaller box within the chest lay gold coins, heavy, stamped with Spanish insignias and wrapped in old cloth. Nearby, a bundle of gold rings and a jagged chunk of raw ore. It was overwhelming. The room was not just storage. It was testimony, a hidden museum of a people nearly erased. Near the bottom of the largest crate, I found a letter, sealed in wax. The seal bore my father's initials. I cracked it open with shaking hands. My son, it began, if you are reading this, then you have found the place I never dared speak of. It was passed down to me and to my father before, as it will be to you. Not all inheritances come through paper and courts. Some are whispered through generations, hidden behind silence and shame. I chose not to give you wealth, because wealth corrupts. I chose instead to give you memory, because memory heals. He wrote of Jason, of how he had changed. Your brother, the letter continued, was never bad, only lost. He learned to measure a man by the balance of his accounts, not the balance of his spirit. I hoped he would come back to us, but he never did, and when he tried to force my hand, to strip the past for profit, I knew I had to protect what matters. He had hidden the original will, the real one, the one I now held. It named me the sole heir to the land and the contents within the house and forest. If he ever tries to take it, the letter said, you will have truth on your side. I read it twice, then a third time, the words digging into the soft places of my soul. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. When I emerged from the hidden room hours later, I no longer felt like a visitor in the house. It wasn't just an old building anymore. It was a vessel, carrying the weight of lives lived and lost, of voices long silenced. I spent the following days cataloging everything, photographing each item with care. I labeled trunks, created an inventory, and emailed professors from state universities who specialized in indigenous history and anthropology. A few responded with cautious interest. One, Dr. Eunice Holloway, expressed deep excitement and asked if she might visit. She arrived a week later with 2 assistants and eyes wide with wonder. What you have here, she said, crouching over a bundle of beadwork, is a national treasure. Most of this would never be found in any museum. It would have been lost forever. She encouraged me to consider a permanent exhibit. At first I was unsure. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I only knew that the items belonged somewhere better than the shadows. But when I imagined them behind glass, explained, understood, preserved with dignity, something inside me stirred. That night, I lit a fire in the hearth and sat by its glow, rereading my father's letter. The words that stayed with me were not about Jason or even the will. They were near the end, when he wrote, "I chose you not because you are better, but because you listened." I did not sleep. Instead, I drew plans on scrap paper, rough sketches of a center, not a museum, but a place of learning, of honoring. A place where children from the reservation could see their heritage alive, where no one had to ask permission to remember. I filed for a non-profit registry the next morning. I sold my truck to help cover initial costs. A friend from the community offered help with design. Dr. Holloway connected me with a foundation that offered grants for cultural preservation. Bit by bit, the vision formed. Each day I worked, I felt the presence of those who came before me. Red Hawk, my father, the nameless carvers of the masks. I spoke aloud sometimes as I sorted through journals and relics, as if asking their permission. And though I never heard answers, I never felt alone. The house that once stood silent now hummed with purpose. Something old had been awoken, not as a ghost, but as a promise. And in the very place where a wall once hid everything, I now saw nothing but doors opening. By the time spring returned, the land had shed its cold silence and began to speak again, first in the faint green tips along the pine branches, then in the thawing stream that trickled past the ridge. The air softened, carrying scents of earth and sap, and each morning brought the sharp cry of hawks circling overhead. The house, once dormant and shadowed, had transformed. The front porch was rebuilt, the roof mended. What had been a shell was now a heart. Instruction on the first pavilion of the Cultural Center had begun in early March. Volunteers from the reservation and students from nearby colleges offered their time freely. We cleared space just beyond the old barn, where the soil was soft and the light generous. It was humble at first, nothing more than a wooden frame, but it stood tall and proud, like the bones of something sacred rising from the ground. Inside, we would house the journals, beadwork, ceremonial masks, and gold artifacts. Nothing would be behind velvet ropes. This wasn't to be a museum for silent admiration. It was to be a place for dialogue, for truth-telling. On opening day, over 200 people arrived. Elders dressed in traditional garments led a prayer beside the fire circle. Children ran between the cedar posts, wide-eyed and laughing. Dr. Holloway delivered a speech about the importance of living memory, and I said a few words too, though I kept it brief. I wasn't used to speaking in public, but I spoke from the place in me that had grown steady these past months. My father taught me that we don't own the past, I said. We inherit it, and we're trusted to care for it. This center isn't mine. It belongs to every name that was nearly erased. Applause came gently, like rain on dry leaves. Some wept, some stood in silence. And when I walked through the building that evening, turning off lights and locking doors, I heard the floorboards sigh, as if in gratitude. The next morning, Jason showed up. I saw him from the kitchen window, his car too clean for the mud road, his figure too polished for the wildness around him. He stepped out slowly, surveying the land like a man trying to recall the features of a childhood home he'd long forgotten. I met him on the porch. He didn't smile. "Well," he said, glancing at the pavilion, "I'll be damned. You actually did it." I nodded but said nothing. He looked thinner than I remembered. The arrogance was still there, but dulled, like silver left out in the weather. "I've been reading about you," he continued, stepping up beside me. "The papers, the interviews, you've got quite the narrative going." "It's not a narrative," I said. "It's our history." Jason looked at me for a long moment, then smiled. "Small? Bitter? And the gold?" he asked. "You tell them about that?" I didn't answer. His voice had shifted, sharpened with interest. "Lucas," he said, now lowering his voice, "I'm not here to fight. I just want what's fair." I met his eyes. "You already took what you thought was fair." He chuckled, stepping back. "You don't know how the world works. You can't just sit on assets like that and expect no one to ask questions." I watched him leave without another word. His car disappeared down the road, but his presence lingered like a stain on a clean surface. 2 weeks later, I received the court summons. The documents accused me of withholding jointly inherited property, concealing valuable historical assets, and misappropriating estate materials. Jason, through his lawyer, claimed that all items found on the property were subject to equal division under the initial will, referring, of course, to the doctored one. I met with my attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Naomi Garrison, who'd once clerked in tribal law courts. She read through the summons and raised an eyebrow. "Your brother's playing a dangerous game," she said. "But he's got money, and he's betting you don't have the stomach for a fight." "I've got more than a stomach," I replied. "I've got the truth." We filed a formal response with the court, including the original handwritten will my father had hidden in the basement archive. We submitted his letter, photos of the sealed trunks, and testimony from Dr. Holloway and her research team, confirming the historical and familial significance of the items. The artifacts weren't assets, they were ancestral, and they were mine not by claim but by legacy. The court date arrived in late May. The room was small, quiet, and suffocating in its neutrality. Jason sat across from me in a tailored suit, flanked by 2 attorneys. I wore a blazer that smelled faintly of cedar and ink, and carried with me a folder worn thin by the months of preparation. Jason's lawyer argued first. He claimed my father had created confusion in his estate, had hidden valuable assets, and that both heirs had a right to access and divide those assets equally. He leaned heavily on financial appraisals, gold weights, artifact market values, even speculative income from the cultural center. When my turn came, I stood with Naomi beside me. I spoke plainly. I told the court how my father had grown up under silence, under shame, under laws that once made it illegal for our people to speak our language or practice our ceremonies, how he had hidden the most sacred parts of our family, not out of secrecy, but out of protection, how he knew Jason would sell what he could not understand. I presented the original will, dated and signed in my father's careful hand, stored with the journals that bore witness to a century of survival. I read from his letter, the part that said, "Your brother learned to measure a man by his balance sheet, not by the weight of his word." Dr. Holloway testified as well, her voice unwavering. "What Lucas Reynolds uncovered is not property, it's patrimony. To separate these items from the context of the land and the family would be to commit another erasure." In the days that followed, the town murmured with tension. Some locals supported Jason, arguing he had a right to what was valuable. Others, especially from the reservation, stood behind me. They remembered my father. They remembered what it cost him to keep those histories intact. When the verdict came, the judge's voice was steady and deliberate. The court recognized the original will as valid, nullifying the contested version. Full rights to the land, house, and contents were granted to me. Jason's claims were denied. There was a long silence in the courtroom after the ruling. Jason didn't look at me. His lawyers gathered their papers with robotic precision. He stood, nodded once, and walked out. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. I made a brief statement. "I didn't come here to win," I said. "I came to protect. My father didn't leave me wealth. He left me responsibility, and I intend to honor it." Jason's fall was swift. News of the forged will spread fast. His investors pulled out of his latest project. His name became synonymous with greed and betrayal. For months, I heard nothing from him. Back at the center, life moved on. We added a new wing dedicated to contemporary stories, voices from our community who had lived through displacement, poverty, silence. The center wasn't just about the past anymore. It was becoming a place where the future could breathe. One evening, I found myself back in the small archive room, leafing through one of the older journals. The light was golden, filtered through the high window. On the desk lay the letter from my father, still folded, still worn from being held too often. My phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. I lost everything. Maybe I needed to. Jay. I stared at it for a long time before placing the phone face down on the desk. Some wounds don't close, but some silences don't last forever. That night, I sat by the fire circle as children from the reservation played nearby. The embers glowed like sleeping stars, and I thought of my father's last words to me. I chose you not because you are better, but because you listened. The trial was over, but the work had only just begun. Summer settled over the land like a warm hush, blanketing the hills and trees in golden breath. The heat was thick and generous, pressing itself into the wooden bones of the house, baking the earth, lifting the scent of sage and pine with every gust of wind. The cultural center stood proud against the backdrop of tall grass and sky, no longer just a vision born in silence, but something real, lived in, visited, remembered. Each week brought new visitors. Families, elders, scholars, school children. Some came quietly, others with questions or stories of their own. The land was speaking again, and people were beginning to listen. The aftermath of the trial had left a quiet kind of victory in its wake. There were no celebrations, no headlines worth more than a paragraph, but the truth had been laid bare and remained standing. Jason had vanished from public view, his name now whispered more in pity than judgment. I had not spoken to him since the verdict, save for that single message, brief and raw. I thought about responding, but each time my fingers hovered over the keys, they froze. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to take. The legal victory had given me the right to pursue reparations, to sue Jason for damages, for fraud, for years of silence and attempted theft. Naomi had explained the avenues clearly. We could freeze his assets. We could petition for ownership of the city property. We could ensure that he never climbed back into the world he had tried so desperately to dominate. But I didn't. I took a walk one evening, down the old path behind the house that wound through the cedar grove and dropped toward the creek. The trees whispered in their secret tongue, and the water moved gently, too shallow now to carry anything heavy. I sat on a stone my father used to rest on, the same one where he'd once taught me how to listen, not just hear, but listen, to the birds, to the earth, to the silence between thoughts. That lesson had never left me. I stayed there a long while, thinking not of what I had gained, but of what I might still become. I thought of Jason, not as the man who tried to steal from me, but as the boy I once followed through the woods, the teenager who protected me from a bully in middle school, the brother who had simply stopped looking backward. And I understood then, more than I ever had, that winning did not require taking. Some victories were quiet, some were simple. Some were not about what you held, but what you chose not to. The next day, I made my decision. I called Naomi and told her to close the door. No lawsuits, no claims, no further pursuit. "You're sure?" she asked, surprised. "I'm sure," I said. "He lost everything that mattered, and if he hasn't figured that out by now, more punishment won't teach him." There was a pause before she said, "You're a rare one, Lucas." I didn't feel rare. I felt tired, but peaceful. Later that week, I gave a press statement. The local paper had reached out again, hoping to print a follow-up. I stood outside the center with the pavilion behind me and the wind playing softly with the fringe of the prayer flags tied between poles. "I don't intend to pursue restitution," I told the reporter. "I received what I was meant to receive, and my brother, well, I wish him peace. I hope he finds something to believe in, something worth more than gold." The article ran under the headline, "Heir Chooses Honor Over Vengeance." I folded the paper and placed it in the center's archive, beside my father's letter and the original will. Another piece of history, another layer in the story we were building together. Weeks passed. We opened a new wing in the center, smaller, more intimate. It was dedicated to oral history, with a recording room where visitors could sit and speak their truth. A place to preserve voices, not just objects. Some told stories of their grandparents, others of displacement or resilience. One woman came every Friday to sing lullabies she remembered from her childhood, her voice trembling but steady. Children began coming more regularly, some from the reservation school, others from the nearby towns. They drew on the stone path with chalk, ran beneath the prayer poles, touched the carved masks with reverent fingers. They asked questions, some easy, some sharp. One afternoon, a boy with freckles and a mess of dark curls approached me while I was tending to the herb garden near the eastern wall. He couldn't have been more than 9. "Did you build all of this?" he asked. "No," I replied, smiling. "It was already here. I just uncovered it." He squinted at me. "But you made it a place, right? A place people come to?" "I helped," I said, "but it belongs to more than just me." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Was it gold that let you build it?" I shook my head. No, it was remembering and listening. He didn't seem entirely satisfied with the answer, but he nodded as if filing it away to think about later. Then he ran off, leaving me alone with the mint and the bees. That night, I walked the grounds after sunset. The lights in the center glowed warm against the darkness, and the wind carried the soft rustle of feathers tied to the roof beams. I thought again of Jason. I still hadn't responded to his message. Part of me wanted to know where he was, how he was. Part of me feared I already knew. I returned to the archive room and retrieved the letter he'd sent. It was short, but it carried weight. I lost everything maybe I needed to. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. I folded it neatly and placed it in a new envelope. I labeled it J. Sun and slid it into the section of the archive we had dedicated to forgiveness. A small shelf, half filled, built not for the world to see, but for us to remember that letting go was also part of survival. The center continued to grow, not in size alone, but in spirit. More elders came, more children sang, more stories were spoken and recorded. We created a program that paired teenagers with community mentors. A mural began on the south wall, painted by local artists and visitors, each adding a piece of themselves to the collective story. There was no plaque with my name on it. I never wanted one. Instead, I asked that the last line carved on the cedar entry post read, "For those who listen, the land will speak." And it did. Years from now, I imagined someone else walking into the center, seeing the carvings, reading the journals, hearing the songs recorded in the oral wing. I hoped they would feel not just informed, but called, not just curious, but claimed. On a warm evening in early autumn, as the sun melted into the hills, I sat by the fire circle again. The flames licked the air in long, thoughtful movements. Beside me, the same freckled boy from the garden had returned. He held a small stone painted with the symbol of an eagle. "Can I leave this here?" he asked. "Of course," I said. He placed it gently by the edge of the fire, where dozens of other small offerings rested. Feathers, beads, pine cones, hand-carved figures. Then he looked at me. "Is this your gold?" he asked. I looked at the fire, at the sky, at the center behind us. "No," I said, "this is theirs." "But what's yours?" he asked. I smiled, knowing I didn't take what wasn't mine. "That's enough." He nodded and leaned against me, quiet and still. The wind stirred through the trees, and I felt something shift. Soft, profound, unspoken. Not an ending, a beginning. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more. You can also check out our other videos and feel free to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.